All right, Lee Spieckerman is here, Spieckerman Media President.
The maximum pressure campaign needs a whole additional dimension. We have a hell of a lot more leverage with China than we're currently using. I'm in favor of a 15% tariff on all imported goods, but for China, until this North Korean situation is resolved, it should be 40% if they don't step up and make a commitment to make that happen, and if we don't see real action.
But Lee, do you think Americans would react positively to something that means the cost of the cars they're going to buy? Let's say they buy anything from abroad, a European model, a Japanese car, and it's 25% more, it's 40% more if you extend it to the degree you want. That's on their hide. That's Washington isn't paying that.
Well, you know what? Buy American. And number two, most of these automakers foreign automakers already have a sizable American manufacturing footprint. They need to expand it. They're also going to compress margins and do whatever it takes to minimize the impact of a tariff like that. You know, at the end of World War II, we had a very high tariff. Even after World War II, we lowered it dramatically to help our allies rebuild after the war. And now we're way past that. And so we need the jobs, we need the revenue. There's no other way we're going to be able to raise the revenue that we need over the next 10 years unless we have a dramatic increase in income taxes or a politically impossible cut in entitlement programs and even discretionary spending. This is crucial for the revenue, and a 15% tariff by historic standards is very little, but it would yield $3 trillion in revenue for our government and enable us to make the income tax cuts that were just put in place.
I don't know. You could make the same argument it could push us into a recession, right?
No, you know what, Neil, look at the history. We have never in American history had an economic contraction following a tariff increase. Not after the tariff of abominations when Andrew Jackson came into office.
I know it wasn't the only reason. It was all presaging the Depression and all that. It was certainly a catalyst.
Nothing to do with the Depression.
All right, a little past midnight tonight, it begins. The trade war, we're told, is on, and everyone is stressing and hand-wringing about it, not the markets, and there's a reason for that. Lee Spieckerman says because it's not a big deal. This is all going to work out, and that the president is taking the right tack. The Spieckerman Media President, Lee Spieckerman, to explain a little bit more. So, Lee, you're not worried about this and argue quite the opposite, that the administration's approach is sound. Explain.
Absolutely. What I'm worried about is the status quo and what was going on before President Trump took office. I mean, this international trade situation was a catastrophe for the United States. You may have read today that, and you probably talked about Chancellor Merkel in Germany saying that our tough trade stance could cause an international financial crisis, which would be laughable if it wasn't so disingenuous. Right now, with Germany, we have nearly a $70 billion goods trade deficit, and then they underspend on defense by another $40 billion. So basically, American taxpayers and American workers are giving Germany and Merkel a gift of $100 billion a year. So no wonder she calls it a crisis. But the real crisis is what's happening to American workers, our $800 billion goods trade deficit with nations around the world, $150 billion of that with the European Union, $400 billion of that with China. It's a crisis, and so Trump is doing exactly the right thing.
But does he do the right thing when he alienates everyone doing it? You know what I mean? Like, it's one thing to go after China, one thing to go after Canada and Mexico and the European Union and India and everything else. Can he be a little bit more selective, show a little bit more discretion? You know, you believe in numbers, Neil. You're a great business anchor and correspondent over the years. The numbers don't lie. $800 billion were in the hole. So you can talk about lumber or specific areas or specific countries. You know, we have these establishment economists and these clueless politicians like Corker and Sassy and Orrin Hatch of Utah and Toomey of Pennsylvania, people I agree with on many issues, who are waxing poetic about free trade, but you notice they never talk about that $800 billion deficit. They don't talk about the nearly 4 million well-paying American jobs that's costing us. They don't talk about the direct impact that's had on the opioid epidemic. Record low unemployment now, right? I mean, but incomes, and that's terrific, and that's a lot of that is due to the confidence and the investment created by President Trump
Trump's election and his policies and
You
his
don't
tax
think
policies.
he's going too far, Lee, or that he's,
I don't think he's going far enough yet. I think we need a 15% tariff on all imported goods. Leo, when people talk about tariffs being a tax, that's true. But as Ronald Reagan said, when you tax something, you get less of it. We have a huge fiscal crisis coming in this country, massive government deficits going forward. We have to get that revenue. Yes, we have to cut some spending, but that isn't going to be enough. We have got to raise revenue. I would rather tax imports and get less of those, which means more American jobs and more domestic investment, rather than raising income taxes again, which the Democrats want to do.
And you're going to respond in kind by sticking it to them. How does that solve anything?
I actually don't think we're sticking it to them, Neil. What we're doing is trying to reach a reasonable equilibrium. If we can just knock $200 billion, 25% off of our goods trade deficit, that would add a full percentage point to our GDP. Remember, growth is the goal. And people forget, and again, these wonderful economists who love to rhapsodize about free trade don't tell us that every dollar that we spend on imports is subtracted from our GDP. So right now, nearly 4% of our GDP growth is hacked away every year by our trade deficit. We have an $800 billion goods trade deficit, a $550 billion overall deficit when you take out services. The other thing we hear a lot about is how wonderful services are. Well, that's great. The trouble is services do not entail nearly as many well-paying middle-class jobs as does manufacturing.
No, you're right about that.
Manufacturing is great.
What would happen, though, if we buy a lot of stuff abroad because Americans tend to be richer people and we like to get stuff, and we do get a lot of stuff from a lot of countries, and the appetite for the stuff that we have just can't keep up with that abroad because they're not as wealthy and they don't have the wherewithal to buy as much.
There's plenty of disposable income to buy American goods. Do you know who the #1 car exporter in America is? BMW. BMW exports more vehicles than any other company. So guess what? They can do a lot more of that. As you know, Toyota and Mazda are building a $1.6 billion plant in the U.S. There's nothing wrong, obviously, with building things in the U.S. We just need policies that make that more attractive. We have the one import that we have a significant tariff on is light trucks, pickup trucks, 25% tariff. Guess what? That is the fulcrum of the American automobile industry. And Toyota makes its trucks here in Texas and Houston. We've got to have an enduring economy that can continue to succeed, and we have got to deal with this fiscal crisis that we have. Where are we going to get the revenue to make up for the huge deficits going forward? And I'm one of those who believes that the tax cuts that President Trump put in place will largely, if not entirely, pay for themselves. But as you've often pointed out, we're still going to have a $10 trillion increase in spending over 10 years.
Money here. No, you're right about that.
Well, we'll cut some, but we can't. We're not going to cut it all. We're going to need more revenue, and it needs to come from tariffs. By the way, one final thing. You know what the United States' #1 export is overall? Our #1 export, do you know what it is?
No.
Treasury bills.
Well,
foreigners this year are going to buy 200. They're going to buy 200 billion. We cannot build an economy based on exporting $200 billion of federal government debt every year.
But we can't build it playing games with our friends. We have friends.
We're not playing games.
Yeah, all right.
We're getting serious about trade. This is an economic crisis.
This isn't
we're getting serious about protecting our workers.
This makes a mockery of economics, Lee. But you're a great guy. I hope this goes and finishes nicely. But I'm worried because
it's good
I think we're playing fire with fire. Lee Spieckerman, always good having you, my friend. Very good read.
The trade war, and you guys have heard this, the trade war that Donald Trump is starting, and that's a lie. Let's talk about this with Lee Spieckerman. He's the president of Spieckerman Media, LLC, a media strategy consulting and television production firm, and advisor to Newt Gingrich in 2012. His presidential campaign. Lee has written extensively on public policy. What's your reaction?
What people overlook is that the establishment, the elites, have a stranglehold on the mentality of politicians and media figures, most media figures, and that is standing in the way of policies that are best for the people. We've been engaged in a trade war for decades, and we've been losing. The media basically laps up the establishment's free trade dribble, and they don't even bother to look at history or look at economic reality and what we've actually done. For the first nearly 150 years of our country's existence, import tariffs were the #1 source of revenue for the federal government. And during that period, we built the mightiest economy and the highest standard of living in human history. So it's not like there's an inherent problem with tariffs. I don't know why we have all these so-called conservatives that have a problem with import tariffs, but they don't seem to have a problem with income taxes, which of course is the major source of revenue for our country now. I'd much rather add more tariffs to imports, which means more American jobs, more investment here in the United States, than raise income taxes. And unfortunately, that is the choice that we're presented with, because even with President Trump's terrific policies, even with the tax cut, even with the barn-burning economic growth we're currently experiencing thanks to the president's policies, in the coming years, we're talking about trillion-dollar deficits. And the only way the politicians are going to plug that hole is by either impossible cuts in Social Security and Medicare, or income tax increases. And believe me, they won't just be on the rich, because there's not enough money there. I'd rather keep income taxes low and encourage earning and investment, and then raise import tariffs so that we're producing more products here in the United States. So President Trump is on exactly the right track with China and the EU. One quick other point on tariffs with China, Chris, is I think until this North Korea nuclear situation is resolved, we should impose a special 40% tariff on Chinese exports to the United States. And I'm not just saying that, I'm not saying that to be clever or to be funny, but that is a national security emergency.
I agree.
And we've got to do something. The media in this country, they're not even taking time to do their own research or look at the actual numbers. We have an $800 billion goods trade deficit in this country. That is costing us, Chris, nearly 4 million well-paying jobs. We've had incomes stalled in this country for 30 years. They're finally starting to rise thanks to President Trump's policies, but we still have this this millstone around our neck of massive trade deficits. And frankly, I think what President Trump has proposed, which, as you said, no countries are taking him up on at this point, of no tariffs, that's only part of the picture. There's a labyrinth of subsidies, of currency devaluations, of unfair regulations on imports that these countries impose, basically to boost their exports and to stifle American imports.
Yeah, that's a whole other show.
Untangling all of that is almost impossible. That's why I think the simple thing is just to put a tariff on. That way we don't have to figure all that out. We don't have to take years to challenge it at the WTO.
Right.
We create revenue that our country desperately needs without raising income taxes, and we create, most importantly, more well-paying American jobs. A retail job in this country pays, a job as a waiter or a barista, that pays $11 to $14 an hour. The average manufacturing job in the U.S. pays $24 an hour. That's a $20,000 a year difference, plus most manufacturing jobs have full benefits.
Last thing I got to get into really quickly. The President of the United States has been accused of undermining NATO because he wants them to pay their agreed amounts to our mutual defense. But really the country that is undermining NATO, and it was brought to light this trip, is Germany.
Not only do we have a nearly $70 billion goods trade deficit, but they're underspending on defense by $30-some-odd billion a year. So in effect, American taxpayers and workers are writing Germany a check for $100 billion every year. And then here they are acting like we're undermining NATO. Almost none of the NATO countries, other than the U.S., the U.K., I think Poland, Estonia, Greece, other than those, no one is paying the percentage that they are supposed to for defense. In Germany, we have a scary lack of ability to deploy military forces because of their underinvestment in defense.
All right, my buddy Lee Spieckerman is back with us. We always get great buzz every time Lee is on because he takes unconventional positions.
Our friends and allies in NATO and the EU have been bleeding America dry in terms of underspending on defense, causing us to have to spend at least $100 billion a year more to make up the difference, and at the same time conduct conducting trade policies that are costing us $150 billion a year and millions of American jobs. So in terms of direct harm to the United States in recent years, there's no question that China and NATO and EU countries have inflicted far more on the U.S. than has Russia. That doesn't mean Russia isn't a nefarious country. It doesn't mean Putin isn't a villainous leader. But let's look at the reality. We have to work with Russia because that is the only other nuclear superpower in the world. But they are not hurting us directly anything close to the way China and the EU have been economically. They are bleeding us dry, and they're bankrupting the fulcrum of the Western alliance.
To get to the 4% level, it would mean the Germans, keep in mind, to spend almost 4 times what they're spending now on the military. After World War II, for obvious reasons, as you know, the Germans themselves said, you know, we're going to cool it on this. And now we're asking, well, uncool it. And I'm just wondering, as a great student of history you are, on any level, does that bother you? Germany spend 4 times, Germany, 4 times what you spend now on defense.
Well, I would say let's start with 2 times. Let's have them get up to the 2% of GDP defense spending that they agreed to. We didn't hold a gun to their head. This happened many years ago at a NATO meeting.
But are you comfortable giving Germany a green light to beef up its military?
Of course I am. Okay. I certainly am. NATO is the greatest alliance in human history. And the United States saying that we want other rich countries like Germany to pay their fair share, which, by the way, is still considerably less as a percentage of GDP than the U.S., strengthens that alliance. It doesn't weaken it. Of course they're going to squeal like pigs. They don't want to. They don't want the gravy train to stop. They've done very well by this system. What I call the hose America and expect America to like it paradigm. That isn't going to happen anymore. President Trump isn't going to allow that. And by the way, it's unsustainable anyway. So it's time that our NATO allies, led by Germany, began operating in a realistic and a sustainable fashion. And that is what's going to strengthen this alliance. And we cannot counter Russia or any other threat around the world unless all of these countries pull their weight. And by the way, talking to previous guest spoke eloquently about an integrated foreign policy. That does have to include trade, because right now, Neil, our country is borrowing or selling valuable American assets to the tune of $500 billion a year just to offset our trade deficits.
Well, this whole
with China
trade back and forth,
EU.
Lee, is making it worse. Like the Chinese yuan is tumbling, so it's actually going to make it worse in the interim because our dollar gets stronger. So our tough talk, and I know you hope that eventually it leads to concessions on the part of these countries that are gouging us, and you're quite right, many of them are, China first and foremost, but we're actually improving their trade posture vis-a-vis the United States because of this very phenomenon.
Well, they're starting to, but they've got a long way to go. And of course there's a rebalancing, and that's going to affect exchange rates and other things. But as I've recommended, and it sounds like the administration is moving toward, we should just have a tariff on all imported goods, an additional 15%, which by historical standards is not very high.
Do you think Americans are willing to do that, Lee? You're willing to, because you're so obscenely rich. You're obscenely rich. But leaving people like you out of it, do you think I'm kidding. But do you think that Americans, when they realize, wait a minute, I thought this was something governments pay, that they're the ones who are going to have to pay it, and it dawns on them, then we have to make a patriotic pitch then to say to them, this is well worth the sacrifice here. Do you think Americans are willing and ready to do that?
I don't just think it, I know it. It's backed up by polling. A leading Republican pollster, Terrence,
saying you're going to go on a diet and going on a diet is very different. You don't have to worry about these things. I cannot tell you the number of diets I've committed to do and not done. Telling the Americans, or Americans telling you that they are willing to absorb this punishment and then absorbing it are 2 different things, my friend.
Well, let me tell you, first of all, the entire tariff will not be passed on to Americans because importers will compress margins and find other ways to cut costs. It's a brutally competitive world economy. That's number one. Number two, no one ever talks about the other side of the equation. We're going to have millions of Americans with either better paying jobs or better incomes because this importing and offshoring orgy that we've had, this importing and offshoring orgy that we've had over the past decades has imploded American middle class incomes. Obviously, when you can access workers overseas making $6 a day, that's going to hurt American workers. More companies can build here in the United States. They're already doing it, as you pointed out in the previous segment. They can do a lot more of it. There is no reason for large-scale manufacturing imports in this country, and we need a tariff to advance that process to make our economy stronger. That is a national security issue. That is the only way we're going to be able to afford funding our military and be able to stand up to foreign enemies.
I love you to death. I love you to death, and especially when you use words like orgy when we're talking about trade. But be careful what you wish for. I'm telling you, be careful what you wish for because
I wish for higher incomes and better American jobs.
We'll see you, Mr. Schmatty Pants. Very good seeing you again, Lee. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful weekend. All right, just a little kidding back and forth there, but I know I'm going to hear from people, and I'm vulnerable this week, but you're still doing